Daybreak it's this incredibly carefully crafted image. And in terms of the subject matter, it's not that complex of a scene. It's a neoclassical scene. There's a woman in repose, reclining. Some kind of nymphish sprite figure is looking over her. So in that capacity, it's really a very conventional picture, right? It's subject matter that would be very familiar. But the dynamic composition, the way that he frames it, it's a highly conventional picture, right? It has all these kind of hallmarks of appeal. It has a neoclassical setting, you've got the Grecian columns, a woman in neoclassical dress, and then this beautiful landscape in the back. And it has the tonalities of it. That's where I think the painting really shines, right? Because structurally it's quite regimented, right? There's nothing that's particularly out of place. Everything is very strictly composed, but there's something in the color, I think, that provides this kind of tactile quality, right? That even though everything has its place, there's this way that the light moves throughout the painting, and it's almost like it invites a kind of touch.
So it's interesting that my eye goes first to the column on the right-hand side because that's one of the highest levels of contrast. But what it does is that you follow the tree line and it points you to and directs your eye to the people in the scene. You don't necessarily look at the people first, which is a really interesting and unusual compositional choice. You look at something that's sort of a secondary element and then you're shunted over to quietly see this sort of delicate, intimate moment. So it's almost like we're a voyeur. We're looking at something and we come up, oh, there are two people there and they're talking. I think it's quite intentional, but the focus of the painting clearly is supposed to be the two figures, but the contrast of shadow and light really is to that column to the right. You're pulled over by the trees and you land on the figures. It's really dynamic because your eye is moving around like a pinball machine through the whole picture, and he keeps you in there, and then you circle into the space, the depth of field into the picture, and then bounce back to the foreground. It's such an elegant composition.
He's using what comes out of, again, Renaissance thinking, is that the warmer something is, the more it comes close to you, and the cooler something is, the more it recedes. And he's playing with those traditions, but he's playing with them in a way that is, it reflects his time in a way. It doesn't look like a Renaissance painting. And I think that's the idea of what female beauty is. These kind of wafy, thin nudes that are really coming out 1920s sort of idea of skinny beauty. But it's more the surfaces, it's the light. It really is simply the light, I think, that's most profoundly kind of memorable about it.
You know, there's an important thing that was happening concurrently with the production of that picture, and that was the beginning of the second half of the American Industrial Revolution. And when that Industrial Revolution happened, all of a sudden we created a middle class that never existed before. And that middle class had a fascination with wealth. And for the first time in history, there was an opportunity to be interested in wealth and pursue it, because it's not really the way it worked up until the 20th century. You either came from wealth or you didn't come from wealth. And that was pretty much the way it stayed. There were very few examples up until the 20th century of somebody working hard and doing a good enough job that they could ever have more money, unless they started out with it, that they could ever have more money than what they needed just to keep a roof over their head. But all of a sudden, with the Industrial Revolution, there was this new opportunity to potentially become wealthy, and that brought with it a fascination for people with the whole notion of wealth and what it was like to live with wealth. And so needless to say, whoever those two girls are in that Daybreak photo, or Daybreak print, they were living an idealized, wealthy lifestyle, a multi-million-dollar estate with giant pillars and a beautiful pool, and these two young, they're essentially children. These two girls are probably in their teens, just enjoying a wealthy lifestyle, feeling completely free and at ease. And that's a very modern notion for the turn of the century.
His style was very much his own. It's obviously influenced by photography. He photographed models and locations and worked from those photographs in order to get the compositions that he would work with. Among his models were Mistress Sue Lewin, various other people. He posed for pictures for himself. He also built sets. He had a workshop with full woodworking capabilities, and he would build sets rather than do actual landscapes, going outdoors to take the pictures of landscapes. He would construct houses and build fake mountains using gravel and rocks that he'd collected that looked like mountains. His painting technique was absolutely unique. It's an old technique dating roughly from the Northern Renaissance, early oil painting. He used, except he took it even further. Basically, he used oil paints, same as we all do, but rather than mix them, he used them absolutely pure and never mixed the colors and used them perfectly transparent, where he would use the white of the board to lighten the colors. He would also never combine two colors in one layer, or at least rarely.
I think like a lot of people talk about his use of blue and his application of paint. To me, is interesting because of how it translates into reproduction too. And he talks about, I think, the relationship of his painting to the Beng-Day dots, you know, the four-color separation printing. And so that kind of idea of how if you know anything about printing, especially of that period, offset printing especially, is it's all relying on transparency. So, you know, it's going through the pigment's going through the white of the page, and then the white is creating that light in it. So it's like he paints with glazes, which is a lot like a printer.
Actually, I am a fan of Parrish, and primarily because I teach color at Rhode Island School of Design, and Parrish's color is unique because it captures a certain time of day, and it emphasizes the contrast of complementary colors, and so it's really a great teaching tool. And the color is so luscious and what I refer to as delicious that it's easy to teach and explain some theories of color in my classroom when using those images. And I just love Parrish.
It's a beautiful technique. It's a versatile technique, but no illustrators have the time to do that kind of thing anymore. It gives you a beautiful, beautiful original that photographs wonderfully. Problem is, of course, you know, with deadlines and, you know, oddly enough, though, I mean, if you think about it, the way we work now digitally, it's the similar sort of process. RGB color is additive color. He was working with transparency, so it's a similar kind of use of color, at least, if not the same technique.
What I find really interesting as an artist, and this is my technical side, is how an artist, like all these artists in different ways, are exploring all these pigments that came out of the 19th century that were synthesized products of the Industrial Revolution, cobalt blues, phthalo blues, any of those cadmiums. You know, he's taking those things that Van Gogh's taking, slapping on with really heavy duty impasto. That's how Van Gogh did it. And he's taking them into these traditional glazes where you put a lot of oil in and you build it up really, slowly. So it's interesting to see how the same materials we admire in someone like a Van Gogh are being almost going back to an earlier way of applying them. But there are the new pigments of their day. So it is you couldn't make that before the 19th century came along. So it's just an interesting time technically to see what people are doing with these materials and how the range. You look at Stuart Davis, who's painting at the same time as he's painting, and they're painting with similar pigments, and you put them side by side and you see these rich colors, but very, very different application and very different ways of saying what they consider beautiful in their day. It's an interesting pairing up of someone like Stuart Davis and him. cobalts and reds and really rich colors, but really on the surface with no glazing. You know, it's interesting to see how people do play with the color and what they can get out of it. And he does a beautiful job with that.
Parrish blue is basically cobalt blue. He didn't invent the color. The color is from cobalt, so it's basically, you know, it's been around for a really long time, but he used it as such a sort of dominant voice in his paintings that he then was associated with that color. And he tended to start with blue in his paintings. He worked in a very kind of interesting and strange way. He would build a painting with all the blue, then all the red, then all the yellow, and layered color. So he'd work almost like photo separation, where he would have each layer as just all that one tone. And that's not a typical way to work. It's kind of what you might do in Photoshop, but he was really using photography in an interesting way early on. So the Parrish blue sort of came in as that system of one whole tone of color, then the next and the next. But yeah, he didn't invent that color.
The way Parrish worked, as I've mentioned, is using oil as glazes. And the way that's done is by simply very, very lightly diluting the paint with a little bit of extra linseed oil. Linseed oil is the binder for oil paint. This is just modern cold-pressed linseed oil. One of the cool things about linseed oil is actually exactly the same as flaxseed oil, which a lot of people take for omega-3 fatty acids, which are the same things which help the paint to dry. So you just add a little bit of linseed oil. If you add too much, it will wrinkle when it dries and your painting will crack. So you just mix that up, and he would mix up one color at a time, so there's never any problem with the paint mixing on his palette. Just make sure it's completely mixed. And then he would use regular paint brushes. This is a hog's hair bristle paintbrush, commonly used by painters, but he would only use it to apply it to the board. His usual working surface was a board. Trying to work on canvas with this technique would not work because you need a stiff backing in order to maintain the dimensional stability, but also to allow for the fairly rough handling that you need in order to apply the paint thinly. So to paint a Parrish sky, he would paint a line of this blue. And you'll notice that the blue goes down fairly opaquely and darkly. And what Parrish would then do is use brushes like this called stipple brushes that are cut off flat at the end, and which you don't use as a stroking motion, but rather you use as a stabbing motion. And over often several hours, you would gradually drive the pigment down the page, gradually tapering off the amount of pigment until he got that Parrish blue sky. And as you can see, some dust will get integrated into it, and that's why you go in and clean it out. But over time, you get a gradation that goes all the way out towards the white of the board. And it gives you a much purer color than adding white to it, which tends to look a little chalky and tends to have a little bit of a problem in terms of keeping that deepness, the glow of an actual sky. And that's it, just hours and hours of gradually blending it out, of bringing a little bit more paint in, bringing the tones down, making sure that they're even so you don't get those areas of extra density. And then you can go in and you can modulate it. He would often use fingertip, tapping a little bit with his index finger, working with rags. Knives can be used to cut finer details into this, which is what he often used for foliage. And then he'd let it dry for a month, polish any dust off of it, varnish it, let the varnish dry, and go through it all again with another color.
In terms of Daybreak, that color is dominantly sort of pinks and golds and sort of purple blue as the shadow color. And essentially the blue is a dominant color, but there are also different versions of Daybreak that are kind of inaccurate. One book that was created, and I think is Ludwig, I believe the last name was, this is a book done about Parrish's work, and the painting on the cover is really, really blue of Daybreak. But then the images I've seen that are more accurate to the original, the National Museum of American Illustration actually has a multitude of Parrishes, and you can see that the color shifts towards a pink purple. It's really not predominantly blue. So this system is based on a kind of temperature situation where you have the warm light and a cooler shadow system. But because it skews to sort of more purple, it feels more phantasmagoric, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's so appealing. It just has this sort of fantasy feel because of that orange to purple relationship of the light versus the shadow. The texture and the detail of the trees, it pulls you to the foreground because it's more detail, it's more contrast of light and dark, that you tend to see that maybe first before you look past that to the mountains in the background, which are softly contrasting. And they're also, the detail is minimalized. So it's really, it's like what you're talking about when you talk about macro micro, it's also a contrast of value, contrast of temperature. The background's really cool, the foreground's much warmer. There's more detail in the foreground, there's less in the background. It's a hierarchy of order of texture, color, value, and light that allows you to move into the space of the picture. And that's, again, that's really critical to a lot of his work. He often worked with things that were not right directly just in front of you and no depth of field. And this is a beautiful example of a foreground, then a middle ground, which has a little less texture or detail back to the background, which has almost very little detail. It's really soft.
The symbolism and narrative of Daybreak, for me, it's about femininity and sexuality. And that, right, so there's this figure reclined in repose, and there's somebody standing over her. And it's not quite clear as to who this figure is, if it's a masculine figure, if it's a feminine figure. There's a certain amount of androgyny there. And there's a kind of implied touch. There's a reclined figure who's essentially available, this kind of like open reclined figure, and then somebody peering down at her, and there's no contact, right? So there, it's like, again, as we think about Daybreak as a kind of momentary time, it's like there's this moment of intimacy between the two figures, and it seems to be pre-sexual, seems to be harking back to something a little bit more innocent rather than explicit, but there is something incredibly intimate about it. So for me, this painting has always been about that transition into sexuality, that transition into adulthood, into femininity.
The more you think about the setting, the more, the more I'm asked to think of, talk about it. Is at Daybreak, how many young, 15-year-old or 20-year-old girls are going to be lying on a piece of marble in a not particularly hot-looking setting, but not particularly cold? It is kind of an odd setting in a way, just to think about it, context-wise, who are these two girls and stuff. I mean, I think it's a nice painting. It has a beautiful landscape in it. It's a nice use of illustration and painting and that kind of tension. It tends to harken back to 19th century art in a way, so I can see why he is, you were kind of frustrated with the fact that so much attention goes to some of these modernists, like Andy Warhol. But I think it's because, in a way, he was using working class kind of materials to make art. And really, Parrish is going to the traditional Renaissance approach to art, which there's nothing wrong with it. I think we appreciate it more now. But I think at the time, he got tied more into illustration, which was sort of the trade of painting versus the art. And you still see that in education today, that kind of tension. And I was thinking about that as I was talking to the other people from RISD, because one of my professors taught in both painting and printmaking at RISD, and I took courses in both areas with him. And I think what was interesting is he pointed this out, and I've always remembered this. He said, it's not the professors that are dictating how they perceive art, it's the students. And the people in illustration wanted to depict realism. They wanted to be able to, it was much more traditionally kind of approached, And in painting, it was that kind of, I'm expressing myself in these, I'm destroying painting by making paint. It's a whole different, So I think, Parrish is really interesting because he's really taking on the traditional side of the arts. And also it meets, an aesthetic that people sought. It's a beautiful painting. I think it's a beautiful use of color. He's using blues like cobalts and phthalos and these transparents and those opaques, and he's really creating a wonderful, light in these paintings, and that's the thing I love most about him. I think that's probably what a lot of people like, and they did translate really well into print.
Let's see. I think Parrish is an interesting figure because of that overlap between the fine arts and the commercial arts, the industry of fine art and commercial art. And that's something that we don't necessarily consider very much when we talk about, okay, so who are the artists of the 20th century? Whereas in actuality, it's artists like Parrish and Norman Rockwell who were working in this commercial mode and were able to really reach a huge demographic of people.
It's the most iconic print, I would think, in the history of printmaking, or printing of, just the idea of printing art, which is really a 20th century kind of an idea. There were other artists like Rogers who were mass producing Rogers Group sculptures at one time, in the mid 1800s and up until the early 1900s. But as far as the idea of printing art for mass distribution, Maxfield Parrish was one of the pioneers of that. Part of it had to do with just the advances that we had in printmaking and reproduction, printing and other kinds of reproduction techniques. Beyond, we were able to do etchings and lithographs and things like that to make multiple copies of things. The kind of printing that Parrish did is really a 20th century invention. We simply couldn't have done it before then. But, more to the point of that specific image, that was really, first off, when you look back at paintings historically, they were primarily groups of people living their lives. And, again, remember that painting was the only way that we had to convey image up until the invention of photography in the later 1800s.
I think one of the reasons that Daybreak was so popular is because it resonated with that theme of intimacy, sexuality, femininity, but it did it in a way that was completely conventionally acceptable, right? So it's in the language of neoclassicism. There's nudity, but it's a very neoclassical nudity. There are no genitals on display. It's very unclear if we are looking at a figure of a masculine body or a feminine body, right? And the model actually was Parrish's 11-year-old daughter, I think. So there are these touches on themes that are, I think, incredibly human, incredibly popular, but it does it in a language that is very, very hard to challenge, right? Very hard to be offended by, because it's so redolent with the visual vernacular, the visual language that the American public was incredibly familiar with. I also think that's part of what the dynamic composition accomplishes, is because there is this structural underpinning to the entire image, right? It falls into this kind of academic category. And because it's in the realm of the academy, the academic neoclassical scene, it has this kind of implicit acceptability.
They look of their time. They give us a window into what they consider beautiful, like as far as the female form. He was employing both traditional methods of painting, but also contemporary pigments. He's exploring kind of retardataire techniques, but he was bringing them into kind of a new place. I mean, he was making them of their time. If we look at some of the artwork in here, you can see that's probably from the 60s, maybe the 70s, maybe 50s. you know, you kind of, even if you don't like it, you kind of want to know that it says something about its time and it's not just romantic. Even though I think there's, you know, Parrish is a romantic painter in a lot of ways. And that's probably one of the criticisms and one of the reasons they don't talk about him today, because of that illustrative, romantic, old-fashionedness of that. And yet at the same time, they're really beautiful paintings. And I think as people become more distant, I think they've learned to appreciate things that they sort of looked at as being not the cutting edge.
This influence on popular culture has been deep, broad, and extensive since forever. Even when you're talking about stuff that's not specifically illustration, movies have taken stuff from Parrish. Animation has taken stuff from Parrish. Even animations, if you look in Miyazaki, there's a number of scenes that have been directly sort of influenced by, if not this painting, then some of his other stuff. Parrish himself is just utterly unique in terms of his approach. It's kind of funny because the work was, you know, when you look at the work, you do realize that it's photographically derived, but it's not photoreal. It's almost as though it's a photograph, but of an imaginary place. And so he's really, really good at transporting you into his visions. And they were powerful, beautiful, influential. I mean, just, if you think, I think in the 1920s, you could see Parrish's work on product packaging, advertisements for everything from tires to chocolates, posters. They were making commemorative plates of Parrish's work. He was the George Lucas of his time.
I think what's most important about Daybreak is that it is just a pivotal moment in the world of art where fine art and the art of the great golden age of American illustration, as it's known now, that was the culmination point, you know, the boiling point, so to speak, where the masses began to understand the importance and the beauty of art, and they could actually own a piece of it for themselves and have it in their home. And it just increased the awareness and appreciation of art among a demographic, with that demographic being the entire new middle class that we had just created. We woke people up to the idea that art is out there and it's accessible. You know, we never looked back after that point. There are many pieces that came after it, a number of other prints that became nearly as famous, but nobody ever hit the nail on the head as perfectly as Parrish did with that print. So far as I know, it's the most sold print ever. I don't know that anything ever outsold it.
In a way, he was one of a handful, I think, of like Charles Wyeth and him, and as really establishing a certain kind of identity to American art. They were taking European traditions and they were bringing it into the 20th century in a way that met the kind of taste of the educated middle classes, the middle classes of this country. And I know people still that just love his blues, love his color, love his sense of evening sky. I mean, he's a very good technical painter. He got his art out there, and that piece is a beautiful example of his ability to take Renaissance and traditional painting and bring it into the 20th century. I think that's pretty important. I also think if you want to understand the American kind of landscape, you need to know people like Wyeth and you know, the Saturday Evening Post covers and all the, you know, the kind of aesthetic, the seed covers of his, you know, seed packages. I mean, all this stuff's collected today, but it was the commercial art of its day. But at the same time, it's really a beautiful kind of example of what they consider beautiful. I mean, that's what studying art is about.